Good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Fifth Discipline Book Club. Uh, Today we've got Eric Wilkie, Wolfgang Brandhuber, and myself, Mark Richards, on the line. We are in Chapter 5, A Shift of Mind, and I've broken one of my screen transitions here somehow or other. So let me just manually do it. And we'll open things up. So, a shift of mind. This is where we finally get into systems diagrams, seeing the structures that underlie complex situations and discerning high from low leverage change. Uh, Gents, before we get cracking on a individual piece of this puzzle, this chapter, as an overall thing, was it a relief to get into the actual systems diagrams, or was it just something different for you? Key highlights of the chapter overall.
So for me, especially chapter 5 was something that I had to read very carefully and read again and again and try to digest that because actually like this is what I'm doing right now. I'm with this dynamic agility thing that I'm trying to pursue, and so he gave so many ideas and hints. Of course, when I read that the first time, it was like it all makes sense. But when I dissected that and tried to apply that to what I'm doing right now, there were so many ideas that I thought, oh, this is something that I really have to look closer into. So chapter 5 this week was the chapter for me because it referred to so much to what I'm doing every day with the client work that I'm doing.
Nice. Eric?
5 was interesting for me. The first time I read through this, it didn't really come through as relevant years ago.
Yep.
Now it seems hyper relevant, but nothing new. And as I was reflecting on why I didn't feel like I was seeing much new here, it wasn't because I read it years ago. I realized because as um, I had a handful of professors in college that embedded this kind of thinking as part of our engineering degree. So a lot of what we did was stocks and flows and delays and resistance and comparing these dynamics of systems across different disciplines and how they in fact, how they interrelated across disciplines. Like, what is when fluids behave a certain way? What does that do to the temperature of the containing thing, and what does that do from a civil engineering perspective next to it? Like, all of that kind of stuff was part of the analysis we had to do, especially in our capstone class. And it was interesting reading through it and looking at it on the cultural side and really saying, okay, I've got this on the engineering side. What is the implication of this in a culture system? And I think a lot of the notes I have in here are going to be anchored on the "and so what" part of the conversation as you explore these things in a culture.
It sounds like it triggered some quite similar links for you as it did for me. Uh, it sent me way back into human systems. Uh, I read it very mechanically, I think, the first time I read it. And this time it was very wide towards human systems, and it headed me into a lot of connections. But let's dig into the
Yeah, I
first
think
section of it.
an interesting observation in the meta is probably that correlates to our aligned thinking is in both chapters, I only had two highlights I had to call out that weren't ones you already had called out. And everything else was a commentary on something else you'd already pointed at and pulled up as a important concept.
There we go. All right. So, detail versus dynamic complexity. A few quotes on screen, but let's zero straight into the highlighted one in blue. The real leverage in most management situations lies in understanding dynamic complexity, not detail complexity. Um, that was the real beautiful anchor point for me. And Eric, I noticed you had a comment there about leverage as it stood out. Can I elaborate a little bit?
It's a topic I don't hear enough about in change management. I'll sit in conversations where product leaders will look at market leverage and where they get a foothold in the market and things like that as they have experience at various scales. But it's not one that I hear, especially people outside of a LACE, even talk about finding the human leverage, finding the point of change that has the highest impact. And even within LACEs, too often I don't hear enough of a LACE lead or a LACE team looking at a line of interventions and a set of potential practices and asking, okay, which one has the highest impact at the point that solves the problem we're trying to solve? Instead of, oh, we should get better at PI planning, or we should get better at X, or we should do more of Y. Instead of, oh, we have a flow problem right here, and it's at the intersection of the product's desired release cadence and our DevOps capabilities, and we don't have a development team mediating that well. What practice fits that precision of leverage?
So, Wolfgang, it looked like your comments were as similar, like your highlights were almost duplicates of mine as well in many cases. But I've just zeroed in on the one from this area that you'd called out differently. Did you want to speak a little bit about what prompted you for the big highlight on when the same action has dramatically different effects in the short run and the long?
Yeah. So, eh, I mean, this is what I'm doing every day, like thinking about dynamic agility, dynamic complexity, and what do we have to change from where we are right now with the more or less static frameworks with certain given rules. Like here is the sprint, here's the sprint planning, the review retro dailies. Here are the roles, the artifacts. To where do we have to go? And so actually, I've never thought before about these like three different categories. They were more like intuitive for me. But when he listed these three categories, this made me stop for a while. It was like, okay, did I really pay attention to the difference in these different categories making systems like dynamically complex? And so I think that this is a good summary of the main sources of dynamic complexity, saying when the same action has dramatically different effects in the short run than in the long run, then it's dynamic complexity. Okay, this is one form. Do we have that? Yeah, we have that in a lot of cases. The next one is when an action, now I can't read because you have your mouse over, but Mark, thank you. When an action has one set of consequences locally and a very different set of consequences in another part of the system, there is dynamic complexity. Yes, of course. But is that something that I paid attention to, or how do we really pay attention to when we are, for instance, in a PI planning or something? Because this is something that we should probably care for. And the third one is when obvious interventions produce non-obvious consequences, there is dynamic complexity. Yes, obviously, but is that something that we pay attention to? And so for me, this is probably something that will accompany me for the next days or weeks or months, I don't know. But having this three categories now helps me thinking in a different way than I did before, because before it was more like a large, whatever, a large fog of things.
Yeah, looking at the when obvious interventions produce non-obvious consequences, I'm like, how on earth did I not highlight that one? That's a nice extra trigger. I found myself referencing back to a couple of other books, and one we talked about a few Saturdays ago was Glenda Ouyang's work, and we were talking about her work on containers, differences, and exchanges. So the book of hers that I've read was Facilitating Organization Change, and the whole focus was dynamic complexity in human systems. And there was just an instant connection for me as I read this stuff to go, oh, she had something to say about that. And so I've got a few quotes that I just kind of linked to here. But kind of straight off that same original highlight, this beautiful quote: if the organization uses cause and effect analysis, it decreases the awareness of uncertainty, collapses the problem decision space, and limits the possibility that creative solutions will emerge. And I think what I really loved about that connection and the kind of extra depth as I went back to her book, and the more I went back to her book, the more I went, it's time for a reread. This notion of decreasing the awareness of uncertainty, because our natural thing is to go, if we can just fill in enough detail in our thinking, from a kind of straight up and down non-dynamic concept, the more we think we can wrap our heads around it. And she's saying, actually, the more detail you think you're filling in with your cause and effect analysis, the more you're kind of closing your senses to the dynamic possibilities. So, yeah, it started me down a very different thread with it. Let's head down. I see Eric again. You've just got a link straight into me around that shift of mind and the interrelationships. Did you want to just elaborate a little bit for us?
Yeah, I didn't have my thoughts fully put together around this, but it was one we've talked in a few different forums around the implication of having consultants do things for you. And as I start to think about drawing these cycles and the benefit of having somebody outside looking at it versus trying to do it yourself and learning the skills, and um, the ability of a typical leadership team to find the time to slow down and do the deep thinking that's required to kind of punch through the cause and effect into the pattern matching, and then from there further into the systems and kind of theory of operation zone. I started just playing with the dynamics of what's the role of a consultant? What's the role of a sparring partner to an executive leadership team to help navigate this stuff, at the same time as what's the risks of having somebody do it for you? And I remember one relatively hairy relationship map that I drew that had, like, I don't know, 15 or 20 different things on a flip chart, and all the interdependencies of this $100 million program, and how I saw the behaviors cascading and influencing each other, which was essentially one of these without the delays. Um, and he kept it visible in his office as a executive director for like 3 months because it had that much impact on him. And I had drawn it while he wasn't there. And he came in the next morning. He's like, "This is yours, right? We need to talk." So I can see the impact of it, but I also play with the risk of that and the dependency dynamics.
Yeah. Wolfgang, fighting complexity with complexity.
So I think that there is something else, or like something related to that I wanted to mention in that, because actually what I wasn't aware before I read that book, and hopefully this is the conclusion is true, but at least it seems true to me, is that detailed complexity, as he describes it, and dynamic complexity are things that you can only have to a certain degree next to each other. Like, you can go in, the more you go into detailed complexity, the more you lose sight of dynamic complexity, and vice versa. Like, the more you go into dynamic complexity, you lose sight of detailed complexity. And this, for me, seems a little bit like a Schrodinger's equation, which actually, like, when I studied electrical engineering, I was really deep into that. Like, it came initially from Fourier analysis, where you could say, okay, if you are too deep in the spatial domain, then you lose the frequency information, and the other way around. Now, this is interesting because actually this was something that popped to my mind when I was reading, and it didn't occur to me before. Before, it was like, yes, you can have detailed complexity, like think of agile release train and the PI planning, and you're creating your art planning board, and there are a lot of details in the art planning board when you decompose features into stories, and you may even have tasks or whatever. And on the other hand, saying, okay, if we have too much detail on the board, then we are losing sight of the dynamic complexity, which is actually contradicting a lot of things that we are doing, or at least what I did in the past. You have to have a certain level of abstraction to be able to still see the dynamic complexity on the board. Now, this is something that I have to investigate, because this is an idea that is new. Even though I think like the concept is clear to me, it's not clear how that really works in real life. Like, what is the application of that concept, and when do I lose sight of what? Now, this is something that I really have to investigate, and this set me on a different path now with trying to. I'm right now shaping a presentation, a new presentation for a large client, and for dynamic agility. And this is an aspect that I really want to have in that presentation, but I don't know yet how. So this is something that I have to think about a couple of days before I will come up with a couple of slides on that, I think.
Particularly given how complex your slides normally are, Wolfgang.
Dynamically complex.
I'm coming to appreciate that style of write the really complex long version and then write the short letter. So I'm gonna encourage him to keep building slides and then keep distilling them into smaller sets of slides.
All right.
I'm good in the first, I'm bad in the second.
So let's transition off to feedback, and starting with the kind of anchor quote to this section. In systems thinking, feedback's a broader concept. It means any reciprocal flow of influence. In systems thinking, it's an axiom that every influence is both cause and effect, and nothing's ever influenced in just one direction. And speaking of distilling complexity to simplicity, his map, his like anchor map, and the many, many words he wrote about, setting a tap or a faucet to the right temperature was just such a beautifully simple example to illustrate such a complex concept as he started to dig into it. And this notion of, I'm filling the glass of water versus I'm causing the water level to rise versus my hand on the faucet is controlling the rate of flow of water into the glass versus, and the one that I just loved, the level of water in the glass is controlling my hand. That was just so beautiful. And Eric, I loved your extra commentary on this one. Do you want to play into it a little bit?
Yeah, so it's one of the things I always, I don't know. I think every agile coach has their trigger words. Like I can say resources or project and watch people twitch in a room. And for me, one of the things is that we've talked about several times is the they pattern. And the worst case of this, the one that triggers me the most, is when somebody believes that their good understanding of agile techniques makes them an expert in finance and an expert in marketing and an expert in human resources and an expert in every other functional domain out there, because all you have to do is agile it.
Yeah.
And they don't take the time to look at the flip side of that. What does it feel like to be told that this thing you've devoted your career to building a real expertise in is simple, just agile it. And the condensation, or condescending behaviors, and the walls that you create when you engage that way as a coach is sad to watch, because there's so much potential in the relationship, but it doesn't show up.
Yeah.
And my metaphor has always been, put yourself on the other side, walk into their space, turn around and listen while attempting to understand their language and their words that are now around you, and see how everything sees and feels.
Yeah.
And when I see the simplicity of the level of the water in the glass is controlling my hand, I look at that other relationship and ask, it just drives me right to, what's the feedback loop between working with other disciplines and their challenges and the role of agility, and just flip the entire relationship 180 degrees. It's the same relationship. You're just looking at it as a completely different thing at that point.
Well, it's that nice, clear linkage back to the beer game discussion last week, right? Of, place thousands of people in the same situation, you get very similar behavior. it's, you know, the level of water in the glass is controlling my hand. The situation in the system is controlling me as a person. And the more empathy you build for the person in their situation, the more effectively you can coach into that. It was, it was nice. Wolfgang, couple of extra quotes from you in this Lincoln area. Linear language. Tell us a bit more.
So, um, uh, so I think Peter Senji is right when he says we are lacking a language to describe these things. And yes, of course, like the example with the water in the glass and the hand controlling controlling the flow of water and things, that would be probably overcomplicated for a lot of situations. But for many situations, having just this linear language is just not sufficient. And then for me, the question was, okay, what would be a sufficient language? And so my thoughts were around when I thought about like Scrum or SAFe as frameworks, there is a certain language that we build around these dynamic aspects. Because for me, and correct me if you see that differently, for me, paying like detailed complexity was a part of project management in the past. You had projects and you had detailed project plans, detailed work breakdown structures. And so for decades, we paid a lot of attention to detailed complexity because we actually were building like not so much dynamic things, I would say, like large physical systems or like houses or bridges or whatever. Now, with the advent of the agile movement, there was a language introduced that at least paid a bit of attention to the dynamic aspect, saying, hey, you have a sprint and you can only plan so far. And let's see what we do in the next 2 weeks. And after the next 2 weeks, we then discard everything and we start all over. So yes, there are certain aspects of like dynamic complexity introduced through the agile movement that we have right now. But is that enough? And I think for me, the feeling is we are in a world right now where the language that we have for describing these dynamic patterns is not sufficient, at least not like on a broad scale. I can, like walking into a large transformation, I can talk with everyone about what a sprint means and what a sprint planning means or a PI planning. But is that already sufficient for the dynamic aspect that we have at hand? And I think the same thing that was true when the agile movement came up like a couple of decades ago in the 1990s, that we needed a shift in language so that we could describe certain behaviors that we have to do to cope with the dynamic aspect of what we are doing. The same thing is I think is probably will probably happen in the near future, that we have to have another shift in the dynamic aspect of how we express that, and the common wording that we are using for this expressing even higher levels of like dynamic behavior in systems. So this was what went through my mind when I highlighted these two sentences here. Does that ring a bell, or is that completely off of what you thought while you were reading this chapter?
I must confess it didn't take me in that direction, but as I listened to you, I thought back to the linkage that happened for me was the discussion we've been having around PI planning, and that question of sort of there's a lens where you look at it through the mechanical, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, right or wrong, and a lens where you distill it back to the principles and you say, how can I leverage the principles to maximize the impact and work out the way that I'm going to tune it, of the trigger to move from a surface level to a deeper level, and the way that when you go down to principles, which is really a different level of language, right? It's not do this, it's think about these things. And the trigger there. But Eric, I noticed you dragged the Jeffrey Moore quote across while Wolfgang was speaking. Do you want to take the ball?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything too deep in there. It's just one of those connections around the number of different areas where we don't have any language, therefore we can't talk about the things with coherency. And Moore was talking about business strategy. This is talking about systems theory. Um, Arguably with SAFe, it was about having a common language for even discussing scaled constructs for achieving agility. Um, and just the number of places where step one is to figure out the words to talk about whatever it is you're talking about. Domain-driven development is a classic example.
Yeah.
What are the nouns and verbs before you even get into what you're trying to do? So it's just a theme that I've noticed across a lot of different dimensions of things I've been thinking about over the last year or so.
Yeah.
And this quote particularly just because it's one of my favorites that I've used in a lot of talks.
I think that common language, like I'm seeing it come up more and more in discussions around, the various scaling frameworks and things. That word of actually, as an organization looking for enterprise agility, you need a common language. But then I have moments where every time I start working with a new client, I've got to learn their language because their acronyms drop a million miles an hour. And I was in a call with a client the other day, and somebody new had just joined the team, so they were doing a round of intros. And he went, so I've been here for 16 years. I was at this acronym, and then that acronym, and then that acronym, and then that acronym, and I've just come from this acronym. And they were all 3-letter acronyms. I recognized one. But everybody else on the call went, I know exactly who you are now. You've given me this string of acronyms, and I can tell exactly the world that you've lived in the bank. And, I know where I'm going. And that world of learning a language so you can talk in somebody's native language, back to your earlier commentary, Wolfgang, is, and perhaps Eric's notion of standing in somebody's feet, the temptation to walk in and go, I'm going to give you a new language. We're going to start talking about my buzzwords, as opposed to, I'm going to learn your language so that by the time I start to use some new language with you, I can contextualize it to go, the language you're used to speaking talks about this. And I'm going to give you a new word. And I like a new word because it's going to help you nudge your thinking a little bit. But I'm going to help you make the mental leap between the two languages. Yeah, it's probably a little bit different to French and English, but it feels that same way as I'm learning the acronyms sometimes.
Yeah, I was literally just thinking about the overlaps with learning language and my school learning of Spanish versus my living in Mexico learning of Spanish, and how wildly different the approaches are. One's very organic and mission centric, and what am I trying to get through today? Somebody broke out a car window. I need to learn the words for window and repair, and like is very mission focused and goal oriented. Versus in school, it was learn how to say hello and ask where the bathroom is, and here's the preterite in the current future tense. Wait, what?
Well, it's like when I was in Germany with Wolfgang. And the Wolfgang I know is the one that we're chatting to right now, who speaks amazing English, and for many people probably speaks better English than me, uh, in terms of the preciseness of his articulation. But then we'd go out to dinner, and I'd say, "Can you translate the menu for me and help me figure out what I'm going to get?" And Wolfgang would be like, "I don't know how to translate this," because all of his translations were in a particular setting as opposed to helping somebody read a menu. And
Fascinating.
we wound up with Sahil getting there faster with Google Translate than Wolfgang could by searching his memory.
This was funny.
I watched you remember it as I was talking. So just maybe continuing that thread, and if I had just one quote from the chapter to select, it'd be the one on screen, and it really just takes us another level deep. This, from the system's perspective, the human act is part of the feedback process, not standing apart from it. And this represents a profound shift in awareness. It allows us to see how we're continually both influenced by it and influencing our reality. And that impact on so many levels. And it comes back a little bit to the notion of othering, or talking about the problem is out there. Being able to place yourself in the system as opposed to describing the system as something else, and being able to recognize the things that your presence in the system is doing is so important. And, I've been chatting a bit on Saturdays about how much I've been enjoying doing some facilitation work with a group at a client recently. And a huge part of my focus with them is developing self-awareness, understanding what's happening in you and how it might be influencing what you're seeing or what you're doing in the moment as a facilitator. And, I read this and I went, oh, there's the link. And it's just put so beautifully. And it looks like, Eric, it did a very similar connection for you.
It does, although you just got me spinning off on the role of self-awareness and 20 odd connections in my brain off that one. And just the criticality of self-awareness to a leader, anywhere from Brene Brown's work to, uh, frankly, just about any of the management theorists that talked about individual leaders. Some element is starting by knowing yourself.
Yeah.
And you can't, like, I actually started the first month of my program is the individual understanding their relationship with the concepts of agility before you even try to push it anywhere else.
Yeah.
But the specific note I had here around consultants is, I think too often we don't draw ourselves. We are in the system, we're connecting with the system, we're changing the system through our presence. But I don't know that I actually ever put myself on the picture of the system that I draw for my clients. Which, reading this and thinking about that, it's a huge gap. Because if I drew these diagrams, I could show where the risk is of them becoming dependent on me in a whole new way.
There's a warning signal, and I saw your comment. I went, oh, that really jumps. One of the warning signals that I find is I start hearing back my name being used as a weapon, right? Mark said it was okay. We've checked in with Mark. And it's like, hang on a second. I never have any decision-making rights with any client. That's not my job. And if people are starting to perceive me as an authority figure, or reference me as an authority figure, there's a sign that something's going really wrong in the way that I'm sitting in the situation. So I saw your comment about the risk signal, and I was like, yeah.
It's an interesting one though, because it's a mark, a sign of authority, a mark of authority. It's a sign of authority when we have that. And there's actually a scary little bit for me where there's time when the ego gets tied up into feeling that sense of validation that comes with that too. And that's actually where my self-awareness trigger, I've got it tuned, is like there's a certain point where it's okay that people are saying, I'm learning this and I checked my work, which is one flavor of that. But then there's another where I'm becoming enough of an influence in the system because of my relationship with, say, the CIO or the person of authority of whatever level, that they believe that they can't move anything without me. And that's the point that I think the systemic problem kicks in and the real risk begins, is you've crippled an organization because of the presence of an expert. Um, and then I frankly, I don't know if other consultants feel this. I haven't really talked about it, but the feeling, the little high that comes from that trill of authority that you get, um, and it could become addictive. I mean, there's a real risk down that path of the ego. I'm not sure. I'm assuming other people struggle with that at times, but that's one that I start to get really wrapped around. It's like, oh wow, I'm in the wrong spot here because I'm feeling good about this feeling. I need to do something with this.
You've got me hunting my brain now to see whether I've ever felt that.
I know it's
So
Wolfgang nodding, so
actually, for me, it was in the past often the other way around. Like, I was invited, of course. Hey, you're an SPCT. Come in. Let's fix the transformation. And I try to be. I try to stay away from that role, saying, "Hey, the only thing that I can do is make you think." And if you are coming up with the right thoughts, the right decisions, then my job is done. But a lot of clients actually, or people within larger companies, they don't want that. They want me to be a certain kind of authority, say, hey, we pay you because we want to know the recipe, and you have to give us the recipe because you're the consultant. What else would justify your salary? And in the beginning, this was something that I couldn't really handle because I didn't want to go in that role. Right from the beginning, it was like something that I tried to stay away from as far as I could, like saying, no, no, let's discuss something because you will probably come up with a better idea because you have the local context information. I have the knowledge about frameworks and things, but you have the information that makes it worth pursuing. But this is something that I really had a hard time until I found a certain balance in saying, okay, if you really want to pay me for having a certain kind of wisdom, then I will try to give as much as you want me to give, but still I want to get into a discussion with you. I want to like that you are getting the idea from the discussion that we have. Am I there that I say I feel comfortable with the situation? No, I still try to keep a balance, but it probably will take a while until I have found something that I really feel comfortable with.
So I'm just going to jump back to kind of two connections again I made from that base quote around the fact that you're part of the process, not standing apart from it. And they sent me down this path of cognitive bias. um, and, that notion of the situation's controlling you and you're part of the situation. Um, there was an instant switch to switch for me, right? To the whole shape the path notion in switch. To change someone's behavior, you've got to change that person's situation. And then that set me down another thread, which was, of course, if switch is the how to do something practical with thinking fast and slow, that's always the relationship for me. Is like thinking fast and slow is, oh my goodness, here be cognitive bias. And then switch is, here's a little bit of cognitive bias and what you can do with it, right? Rider and elephant versus system one and system two. But I went back and I went, oh, thinking fast and slow. I bet I highlighted a couple of things over there that really reference back to this. And I just grabbed two quotes from Thinking Fast and Slow. We can be blind to the obvious, and we're also blind to our blindness. And our comforting conviction that the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. And they both really resonated with me in terms of that self-awareness of how the system's impacting us. To go to a Jerryism, you've got Jerry's got this metaphor of the pickle in the pickle barrel. If you put a cucumber in a pickle barrel for long enough, it'll become a pickle. And the fact that as a coach, if you're embedded with an organization long enough, you start to become shaped by the organization. And, part of our role is always objectivity. But it definitely raised this thread for me of that when you're thinking about systems modeling, and I'd never thought of this before until all of these connections rang off in my brain. When you're thinking about modeling systems and they're human systems, and you start to think about what's the role of cognitive bias and how does cognitive bias potentially turn up as an element on a systems diagram, um, that was a whole new level of thinking for me about systems modeling.
I loved it.
Um, just an observation. You're talking about the acronym history. We're doing the same thing with books and management theorists here.
This is a very valid point.
I did drop the
I
links to
saw
the
that.
various
Thank you very
things
much.
Mark mentioned into the show notes, but it's like I can't even keep up with his references of books in this section. And yet we're all following in the conversation, which is just common language.
Yeah. All right. Wow. We obviously got triggered a lot by that detail versus dynamic complexity. Let's jump forward a little bit to reinforcing processes. And I love the little iconography he uses of the snowball. And I'll be honest, the first few times I was reading these diagrams, it's like, what is that thing? And then eventually I figured out, he's got a snowball as the iconography for a reinforcing process. And he's got what would it be in American? A teeter-totter.
Same.
Yeah, that's we call it a something else. Man, I was so busy hunting the American word, I can't remember what it was. We call it something very different. um, but his jump into the various types of processes, reinforcing obviously being you create either a vicious or a virtuous cycle. And his reference back to the Pygmalion effect and the small change that builds on itself, and the way that it amplifies itself to build more movement in the same direction. Wolfgang, I saw you loved one of the Pygmalion quotes. So why don't we head over to your Pygmalion effect highlight?
So this was probably one of the strongest impressions that I had from that chapter. And so he speaks about this Pygmalion effect that we actually that I'm discussing on a regular basis with my wife. She's a basic school teacher, and so of course this is something that matters. You can be very positive to pupils or very judgmental, and what if there is a pupil who has bad marks? How do you deal with that so that there is no reinforcing loop? That maybe this boy or girl um, wants to get better, and it is not like doesn't feel like having a stigma or things. Now, this is just the thing that we are discussing in like everyday life when we are discussing about her work, but when to when I applied that, while I was reading that, when I applied that to agility and to the agile world that we are living in, the detailed complexity versus dynamic complexity, then there is something completely different popped up for me in this thought. It was like when I'm looking at a Scrum team, and the Scrum team may consist of like 10 people. And now there are tasks to do in the Scrum team, and probably you will have substructures in the Scrum team, like there are 2, 3, 4 people working on something while the others are working on something different, which is absolutely fine because in the sprint planning they agreed on a sprint goal and they agreed on a sprint backlog, and everyone knows where they are heading to, and they are sharing responsibilities, and the substructures that are like set up immediately when it's needed, they are just part of the game to be able to cope with a certain amount of dynamic complexity. Now, when I think of that as like as a PI in a PI planning, is it something different than what we see in school? And actually, I thought no, because like in school, we say, hey, if we are reinforcing a certain behavior, like there is a pupil in school who is really good, and you're giving that feedback, and this guy probably wants to get even better because now he has the feeling, oh, I can do something, and I can get better at that. Do we do that like in PI planning? Usually not. Like we restrict the people to staying in the teams that they are. Now, when we, for instance, have two teams and they have to closely collaborate together to achieve something that we agreed on in the PI planning they should achieve. Now, can we give them the reinforcement saying, hey, you are working on that thing anyway, so do whatever you want to build as substructures within this like larger body of two teams, so that you can cope better with the dynamic complexity that you have at hand. Meaning, hey, you can shift over like two people can shift over from one team to another if you see fit. Like the same ad hoc structures that are coming up in Scrum teams are not coming up on a larger scale. And I think this also pays into what we discussed before, saying we probably need a different language to cope with a different level of dynamic complexity. Now, we are absolutely fine from a management perspective if there are substructures in Scrum teams. We are not that fine if there are substructures like ad hoc substructures in HR release trains or in part of HR release trains, because we are not reinforcing that behavior. And this is a kind of a Pygmalion effect, I think, that we have when we have a certain language, like this is the safe model and this is how it's applied to the behavior of the people. And so this is probably something that I have to put on slides, but this is probably something that I really have
It's
to
always
think
something for you
deeper
to put on
about.
slides, mate. I'm going to jump in because we started this morning thinking Dave wasn't going to join us, but he's popped up. So I'm just going to bring him in.
Great.
Good, whatever time of day it is there for you, Dave.
Hello.
You made it.
Yes, I think I have a clocks changing issue.
Oh, have you just had a daylight saving switch?
Sorry?
Have you just had a
It-
daylight
it-
saving switch?
Yeah. Am I an hour late?
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay, that's why.
you're 5 minutes early to be an hour late, so you're right on time if you had the right start time.
Well, I got push to talk work.
Well, that's always a nice thing. Oops.
Sorry,
Great
chaps.
that
I'm
you're here,
honestly
Dave.
too stupid. I should have realized.
Better late
But
than
I had
never.
the same problem. I had the same problem like you. I would have been an hour late if my computer wouldn't have reminded me that there is this daylight switch happening for me, which hasn't happened in the States.
You're just in time though, mate, because you dropped a beautiful diagram on the Miro that we're a few minutes away from getting to. And I'd sat there going, I was looking forward to chatting about that. But I'm going to take a moment before we get there. We're down in reinforcing processes. And I'm going to drag us back to Switch because there was a linkage here for me to, again, a bit of a chat we had last week. And this notion of find the bright spots in Switch. So when you spot movement, you've got to reinforce it. And, you know, the second quote, the bright spots provide not only direction for the rider, but hope and motivation for the elephant. And this concept of bright spots creating reinforcing loops. And they've got some brilliant examples in Switch about that. But then the interesting link is back to the discussion Eric and I had last week, where we kind of jumped into that whole, if we live our life in bright spots, are we potentially creating a problem because we're reinforcing and building pressure? And then that starts to come out in terms of the pushback that eventually emerges in a limits to growth type system. Because if you look at that notion of the Pygmalion effect, and you think about it in terms of who you spend time with coaching, I am always drawn to people who are thirsty for what we're trying to change together. When I'm picking the time that I spend in an organization, it's like, let me find the great leaders and support them and help to turn up their agenda. As opposed to, am I really going, well, these are the people in the organization that I should be spending time with? Because although they might not want to spend time with an agile coach, or maybe if they didn't know I was an agile coach, I'd have much more chance of getting time with them, that they're actually the really important things in the moment. And, we can easily just be drawn to spending all of our time with the people who love the path of agility and, get into that Pygmalion effect, but ignore the wilting flower. I'm watching deep thinking happening on your face, Eric.
Yes and no. I'm actually looking forward to the second archetype in the next chapter, and I had a lot more thought around this topic there. So I'm trying to hold off a little bit.
Let's hold it. Let's talk about balancing processes. So if that was reinforcing, balancing processes, opening quote was beautiful, and it was the back end of a big discussion about a production use case. The reason costs don't stay down is the system has its own agenda. There's an implicit goal, unspoken but very real, the amount of work that's expected to get done. So they were talking about an organization where they were trying to encourage people to work less hours and get better work-life balance. And his systems diagram was plotting why it didn't actually work. And it was this notion of there was a balancing, stabilizing system that there's a self-correction that attempts to maintain some goal or target. And, the big quote I called out in this was, what makes balancing processes so difficult in management is that the goals are often implicit and no one recognizes that the balancing process exists at all, which, of course, has lots of links back to cognitive bias. But Dave, talk us through, and I was cursing you last night because I saw this diagram and I went, now I'm going to have to buy the field book.
Yeah, it's like a lot of translation between the theories in this book and so there's lots of templates and things in there. But I thought this was great because it's got that cascading view of how all these different archetypes fit together and which side of the coin they're on. And I just thought it was really fantastic. So I hadn't read the other chapters of this book, but I was reading the field guide, so I was getting this stuff from one book earlier than it was giving us in the fifth discipline. So I think it's fantastic. You've got all these different archetypes underneath reinforcing loop and balancing loop. I just thought it was such a beautiful kind of visual cascade of these different things you can use.
Yeah, I found myself last night going forward, and because the next chapter has those first two archetypes, but then I wanted to play. And as soon as I started to play, it's like, well, what are the other archetypes? You've got to go all the way to the appendix to get it in the main book. And then I saw this and I went, that's going to be beautiful as a directional pointer.
And Dave, just a quick question on this. Are the shapes on there for each consistent with the ring shapes that you tend to see when you map it out? Is that the intent of all of his little shapes?
Yeah, so that, yeah, exactly right. So the little things you see on this are like they're kind of like the same as those other diagrams, yeah. So, but there's more of them. So, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, it was literally, I saw this one diagram and I went, yeah, I'm buying the field book. I'd been listening because you brought it up pretty much every chat, and it's like, no, don't feel tempted, don't feel tempted, don't feel tempted.
It is actually really good. It's a really good book.
Who else had a linkage here? Here we go. This looks like, I guess the placement tells me it's an Eric highlight, but I could be wrong. Leaders who attempt organizational change often find themselves unwittingly caught in balancing processes. Whose was that one?
That was me.
Dave.
So I came at just the right time.
You did. Do you want to talk us through the standout for that one?
Well, I guess the thing with this one is leaders can often find themselves caught in these balancing processes. How do they get them out? How do they get out of that kind of set of loops that they're in? It's an almost impossible situation to ask some leaders to effect change when they're so in. But the process is basically the whole culture is what they've made it. How can they get themselves out of that? That's almost an impossible thing to ask. So I just thought it was fascinating that when we work with senior leaders, we have to understand that context, that they're in those difficult positions.
So back to empathy. I'm going to take us back to the connections I drew there, because I'm back to Glenda Ouyang and facilitating organisation change. And, the trigger for me was this quote at the bottom about resistance to change is neither capricious nor mysterious. It almost always arises from threats to traditional norms and ways of doing things. And they're often woven into the fabric of established power relationships. And if you think about the work we all do, and change resistance and various aspects of that, right? This is just central to our lives. And there were so many connections there back in Ouyang, right? At the same time that new patterns are emerging, the old patterns are influencing the behavior of the agents. The system-wide patterns can be considered both effects of previous agent interaction and causes of future agent behavior. As the patterns emerge, they constrain the behaviors of the parts in their future interactions, right? Translates directly into a systems diagram. But this was the one I loved. Too rapid change will threaten relationships on which the organisation depends. Too slow change will stifle the possibilities in an uncertain future. And we've all been in organisations who are either trying to go really fast with a change. I was talking to someone recently who did a agile transition simultaneously for 27,000 people. That's a very fast change. And the kind of tension that lies between those is it's glorious. I saw it formed a connection for you there, Eric, as well. Cultural momentum.
Yeah, I'm pulling a quote over as well, but the way you were talking about that, but just this whole idea that continuation is the easiest. Like, and specific what I was pulling over is a quote from the inertia chapter in Dealing with Darwin by Jeffrey Moore. And maybe I'll just read this. In the context of now you've got a great strategy, you're getting ready to execute on it. Now you face one more hurdle to realizing its vision. You must overcome the inertia of your own organization that fosters resistance to making the changes necessary to implement it. Executives faced with this challenge tend to demonize inertia. They see it as a passive-aggressive response to their dynamic leadership agenda. It is no such thing. Inertia is the property of an object in motion to stay in motion. As such, it is an ally of the current strategy, helping it to stay its course. It is the legacy of the last innovation. And I read this, and
that's
it's
a
like,
great
and
quote.
I just used it in a chapter I'm writing in the book today, and it was talking about, it's like, this is a phenomenal characteristic of your organization right up until the moment you want to go a new direction. Bringing it back to the purple note, this is for me all about, I've long had a saying that culture is the sum of all behaviors. Change how people behave, you will have changed the culture. And rather, instead of treating as the culture as this distinct magical thing that is esoteric and above and around the company, it's the accepted behavior set. And that's what makes it so hard and so easy at the same time.
Which jumps you, of course, to Jerry Weinberg. Your organisation is the way it is because it got that way. All right, let's talk about delays, because I'm keen to just transition through this and open the next chapter. Nothing else is jumping out at me in terms of your notes. So if we play with delays, this, of course, is this notion of the delay before the response emerges or the impact or influence emerges. We've talked a lot about delays. They really stuck out to us in a lot of the last week's conversations. And, his beautiful analogy around the water temperature. And I think we've all been there. You're in the shower. It's an unfamiliar shower. And you go from freezing to screaming from the heat repeatedly. It always gets me when I go to America because your taps and the way you control temperature are so different to our taps that I'm in this moment of trying to go, how on earth am I meant to set the temperature of my shower at the same time as I'm overcorrecting wildly because I'm wondering whether I'm actually figuring the tap out. Things you never knew
On that
about differences in taps, Eric.
flip side, of course, is the more globally traveled you are, the easier it is to adjust the taps because you have to learn the systems theory very intuitively and safely, or you get scalded or frozen.
So I'm going to kick us off because this is my second favorite quote from the chapter. The more aggressive you are in your behavior, the more drastically you turn the knobs, the longer it will take to reach the right temperature. That's one of the lessons of balancing loops with delays. Aggressive action often produces exactly the opposite of what's intended. It produces instability and oscillation instead of moving you more quickly toward your goal. And there's obviously a linkage to the illusion of taking charge from previous chapters. But the really big linkage for me on that one, and I think systems diagrams give me a very different way of leveraging this because it always sits there in my coaching theory, is going back to facilitating organization change. So the whole thrust of the organization change work for Glenda Ouyang was this notion of saying, you've got to sense the current state of the system and then design an intervention. And your system is either going to be over-constrained or under-constrained. And you've got to understand whether it's currently over-constrained or under-constrained, and then design an intervention that's going to move it back into balance. And then you've got to sense the impact of your intervention and work out whether it's moved in the direction that you intended. Did it move it far enough? Did it move it too far? And, you then design your next intervention based on what you observe of the impacts of the current intervention. And I've always used the parallel of a car skidding down an icy road, right? You're heading towards one side of the road, you go full wheel lock to get out of the emergency, and then you skid back to the other side of the road. And I think a lot of people down the agile path do that, right? Documentation is evil. We'll do no documentation. No documentation is terrible. We'll do more documentation than we ever did before. And this constant massive course correction, as opposed to going, what are the small nudges to try and steer a gradual path down the middle of the road? And there's such a temptation to go for the big swings, the super aggressive behavior, as opposed to going, what's the small intervention that's going to move? And then how can I observe the impact of that intervention before the next one? Just moving across, I saw a quote from you, Wolfgang. Looks like the wrap for the chapter quote. Structures of which we're unaware hold us prisoner. There's a nice loop back to the title of the chapter. Do you want to talk us through what stood out for you in this one?
So there is it ties back to one of the quotes that I had above this one, which I was pulling down here. Steering a car and staying upright on a bicycle are also examples of balancing processes where the goal is heading in the desired direction. Now, this is actually something that I use in the trainings that I give because there is often the question, but like if you are changing dynamically according to the dynamic complexity that we have, so isn't that contradicting the paradigm that we usually have in the agile world, saying you have to have stable teams or stable trains? And the example that I usually give is saying, okay, now this is like a cup of water, and if of course the cup is stable, and if I drop it, it breaks, and then it's useless. But this is not the same kind of stability that we are aiming for. We are aiming for more a car that we are driving down the road, and with turning the steering wheel, we are able to to follow the flow of the car, the flow of the road, so to speak. Now, this is a kind of stability that uses the same word. Like, this is a stable structure, like a cup of water, and driving down the road in a stable manner uses the same word, but it's a different kind of stability that we're talking about. And so, this structures of which we are unaware hold us prisoner. This is something that came to my mind when I read that, saying, "Yeah, this is such a typical example when I'm just like when I just have this idea of stability in mind that something is fixed, like a stable team is a stable team for eternity or for a long time, or a stable agile release train is a stable agile release train for a lot of PIs." Then I will probably not be able to steer the road with all the bends that the road have. And so this is something that it's really important for me to try to get better at explaining that, because I think this is one of the big paradigm shifts that we will see in the next years to come, that we are getting away from this fixed idea of stability to a more moving notion of stability. So this is like what concludes this chapter for me.
All right, let's go and at least open chapter 6. Nature's template, and I must confess, I looked at how many quotes were dropped in this morning and I went, we're going to struggle with it last week's pace. But nature's templates, identifying the patterns that control events. So if I kick this one off, I would say my previous play back when I went through a year or two of systems diagrams being my favorite toy. At the time I did it, it wasn't inspired by Sengi stuff. I did it based on Lahman's work, and I forget the name. There was the Lahman book that was the best book on scaling that I leveraged all the time until I discovered SAFe, and then SAFe referenced Lahman's book a lot in the early days, right? But he had a lot of emphasis on causal loop diagrams, and I went through a period of drawing an awful lot of causal loop diagrams, but I never put in the overlay of the archetypes. And I would wind up every time I drew one with a whiteboard that just got fuller and fuller and fuller, and then weird and wonderful things because we'd be following some chain, and then we'd run out of whiteboard and be like, okay, there's a little bit over here, and I'll draw a really long and squiggly arrow, and we keep the thing going. And it was always useful because you get some point that's going, oh, we keep turning back to here, and that's the point of leverage. But this idea of going, what's the archetype? And how does that frame the way I start to think about visualizing the system was the big jump out for me in this chapter. I read the beginning of it. I went, that's interesting. I never played with systems archetypes. And then when I had a bit of an experiment last night to go, I want to at least try doing an archetype diagram for each, just to kind of dust the cobwebs off and try using it with archetypes. I found it really impactful in terms of framing the way I thought about the visualization. So that's my archetype intro. And it looks like, wow, I see 3 purple post-its before we get anywhere near the first archetype. Is this your quote to go with your purple post-its, Eric?
It is, but before we do that, what do you mean by archetype? What's an archetype?
You're going to slow down the buzzwords, aren't you?
Just this one, because I think it's one that I bet we have 4 different impressions on this call or more about what an archetype is.
So I look at an archetype, and to be honest, I go back to, in many ways for archetypes, I go back to the days when I was a dev and I played with patterns. Right? I have a problem to solve. It's this type of problem, therefore this pattern might be useful to me in solving it. But I've got to recognize the type of problem before I can recognize the type of pattern that's useful. And so I look at an archetype as a classifying concept. Here is a situation. You can recognize that situation as being in this classification. Therefore, once you've found this classification, you know which types of tools are likely to be useful to you. That's me with archetype. What would it be for others?
In the field book, they define it as a type of mental model that you use, and then you can recognize that mental model or that thinking pattern, and you can then create that structure, that library of them. So yeah, they're mental models that make thinking through complex things easier.
That's a much easier this version of it than mine. I like that one. Eric?
Yeah, I feel like that's a definition to copy in. For me, they're sufficiently recurring patterns that I want to substitute the pattern for having to explain the whole thing every time. And I think I take archetypes as a result and bring them very close to the pattern community and pattern languages.
Could I request, Dave, that you find at some point that quote about the mental models and drop it onto the Miro as a bit of a cheat for us?
I will.
Let's head back to this opening quote. Eric, was it yours?
It was. I'm just doing a little test. So it's really just the bright. I was thinking about the bright spots, and we talked about it in the previous. It's like, but there's this role of intuition where, and I highlighted it in yellow there. The experienced managers already know many of these recurring plot lines intuitively. They just don't know how to explain them. The systems archetypes provide that language, and they can make explicit much of what otherwise is simply judgment, management judgment in quotes. And the more I look at this kind of thinking, like there's a habit I think I've seen a little bit out of the Kanban community had it for a few years, and then I see the product community having it, and it all goes along with that whole "you're not your own customer" thread. It's like, well, you have to have data. It's like, no, you've got years of experience. Trust yourself. Your intuition isn't usually wrong. It's just occasionally wrong in a lean world. Sometimes common sense isn't very sensical. But I would far rather say trust your judgment. Let's give you a new lens to overlay on top of that judgment than to go through that demeaning pathway of, oh, you don't know anything, we're going to start over. And it's kind of like the walking into finance with, here's Agile, go do it. So this whole paragraph in section really told that story for me. It's like, you've got this judgment, you've got this intuition, but it's really hard until you have the language to talk about it. And sometimes we need to push the system to a different set of behaviors so you have the contrast to actually talk about the old behaviors. And when I think about old days doing Scrum at a team level or a modern language using SAFe at a team of teams level, it's like, oh, suddenly all the problems are remarkably visible because we're doing it in a different way. And we have words for it.
Which links beautifully to your other quote that I just spotted over on the right. Making explicit much of what is otherwise known as simply management judgment. Was that you again, Eric, or did somebody else? That's a Wolfgang one. So
Yeah. So I highlighted the same like Eric.
Yeah.
And if for me, so I'm thinking of these archetypes as a level above the frameworks that we are using. It's like, which patterns from the framework do I want to bring in to solve a certain problem? Now, these archetypes, I think, really help in coming up with a proper solution or narrowing down the tools that you're using from the frameworks to come up with something that you at least have a hypothesis that it could work. So this is, I think that I don't know whether this is true or not, but I think this is something that we will also see in the future more and more, saying, hey, the frameworks are a certain level of abstraction, but probably when we are steering larger transformations, we have to have additional levels of abstraction, and this level of archetype is a level of abstraction higher than the frameworks, and it guides me in taking parts of the frameworks to apply to a certain problem. So this is how I think about it.
The patterns of influence. It's nice. Let's open the first archetype, limits to growth. So a reinforcing or amplifying process set in motion to produce a desired result. Reinforcing. It creates a spiral of success, but also creates inadvertent secondary effects manifested in a balancing process, which eventually slow down the success. The jump out highlight for me for this whole archetype was the one I've got in green down here. As intended changes start to be implemented, problem solving and results start to improve, which strengthens commitment to the intended changes. But the more successful the changes become, the more threatening they can also become, and those threatened begin to undermine the change implementation. And his recurring theme here of success with change breeding threat just resonated so strongly with me from my last 15 years of work that it wasn't funny. Did
I think
you guys? Sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say that I also have heard transformation being talked about as being you're working inside a body, but when you get to a certain level of change, the antibodies of the system fight back against you and try and kill you because they see you as a virus. And that's a very true thing, is that your transformation can be seen by other parts of the organization as something horrendously threatening. So they will literally try and kill you, and it's astonishing that happens.
And I think sort of flowing through on that. So, we always love to talk about the system of work, and my thread of evolution, right? I launch an art, I launch a team, something begins to be different. Is you begin, you have early energy, you see early runs, and then it slows down because you hit that natural brick wall, which is to go, this is how far we can change before the system of work changes to enable us to evolve further. And I've always run that thread of, well, the system of work's the limit. And, you change what you can at a particular point in time, then you recognize you've got to shift your attention to the system of work. And if you can unlock that next level of change in the system of work, whether it's how finance works or the way service management works or, existing standards, and then you can unlock that door, and then you've got a chance to go further again with your vehicle that's trying to drive evolution. And so I've always gone to, well, I know the system of work is the limiting condition. But then what Sengi does in terms of the threat and the control-oriented managers, if you think about the system of work and the nature of manager who tends to sit in a lot of the system of work, the thing that jumped for me was, in going to the system of work, I've really been probably stopping a step short because, and I know this intuitively, it makes sense and it's kind of translated for me intuitively, but that notion of the real limiting condition being the threat to the manager of that section of the system of work, as opposed to the system of work itself, and just really putting that in the foreground of your thinking, and particularly when you put yourself in their shoes, what is the threat coming at them? That the whole value proposition of what they've spent a lifetime becoming great at in their bit of the system of work is null and void because the agile people say it shouldn't exist. Big jump points for me.
And I think you get that because the agile people say it shouldn't exist is the part I start to zero in on, is what are we missing when we say that? So
I'm hunting for highlights from you guys. So here we go. Your highlights have landed in the next section. So transitioning a little bit deeper into this first archetype, my highlight quote was, in each of them, leverage lies in the balancing loop, not the reinforcing loop. To change the behavior of the system, you've got to identify and change the limiting factor. So just before we go hunting around the highlights I've seen from you guys, I just caught the base images. So I love the fact that he's got this habit of going, here's a pattern image, right? You model it like this. And coming back to his iconography, in the beginning, when I hadn't really paid mental attention to the iconography, I kept trying to look for the arrow directions. Right, because if you think about causal loop diagrams, they put annotations on the arrows. Is this an opposing impact? Is it a reinforcing impact? So on and so forth. And I just so struggled to read his diagrams going, I can't make sense of how those arrows are meant to work because surely that's meant to impede it, that's meant to grow it. And it's like, oh, okay, is it a snowball or a teeter-totter? seesaw is what we call them now that I've broken my mental block.
I had that answer for you because I looked it up online and I just chose not to interrupt.
So, this is the classic model for it is I have some condition in the middle. I've got a growing action on one side, I've got a slowing action on the other side, and I've got a limiting condition that's driving the slowing action. And, to take my previous example, if the slowing action is the system of work, the limiting condition may well be the threat to the people who own that area of the system of work. Easy illustration on the jump. But let's jump to your quotes. An extra lesson to the limits of growth structure. Here's just this quote.
That's me. I didn't have a lot in this section actually, but when I got to this one, I noticed it was one of the few that was missing in your list that I had highlighted. And it's an interesting parallel for me, just that he's basically saying theory of constraints only in the systems world here.
So
It's not the simple lean theory of constraints and a straight line manufacturing line or assembly line. But it is a very real one, is every time you break one of those limiting loops, so it's not the constraint, growth will hit a different one. And maybe this is in the field book and not clear in the sections we've read yet, but just thinking one or two ahead and starting to erode problems 2 and 3 at the same time you're focusing on problem number 1 might be a wise course of action. But don't invest time in problem number 30 yet, just like we talk about backlogs.
So you realize you've just committed yourself to another link to the goal, right? Theory of constraints, we're back in buzzword bingo.
Oh, crap. Yep.
All right. So I'm going to expose myself to ridicule and go, here was my play with attempting to model one myself last night. And I found it really interesting trying to hone myself into the core structure of the archetype. Because, I think I mentioned in the first episode, I went through a period where I drew lots of causal loop diagrams, then I hadn't drawn one for years because I was just intuiting my way through. And so it was like, well, I'm rusty, but I never drew them with this before. And mine always went up these huge sprawls. And I went, no, I'm just going to try and get a really simple one that anchors to the model he gave us and see what happens when I enforce that simplicity on myself. And, what I took was what I often find, and I usually describe it in the metaphor of Ouroboros, the snake that eats its tail, that a lot of arts get trapped in where they haven't done enough prep when they get to their first PR planning. So they make a questionable plan and overcommit whilst promising themselves they'll do better prep next PR planning. And then because they overcommitted with a shonky plan, they're too busy managing the chaos of their shonky plan to do the prep that they promised themselves for the second PR planning. So they make another shonky overcommitted plan. And then they just get trapped in this world. I mean, yeah, we've been talking a lot about PR planning lately. Why don't I have a crack at that as a systems model? So I'm just going to open myself to feedback.
I love it. So there is a certain truth in that also from the HR release trains that I have seen, that it's actually a process that is slowing down. It's like in the first PI planning, you may have, or the first, second, third PI planning, you may have a lot more that you want to achieve compared to the original project management structure, and you may even be able to achieve more in the first couple of PIs, and then it slows down because you are you are introducing other mechanisms into the system that actually you hadn't anticipated or you hadn't paid attention to. And so you're trying to, as you wrote, you're trying to spend managing these problems, and then the whole system slows down and you reach a certain plateau. And this may not be a lot higher than what you achieved in the project management world before, depending on the situation that you are in. It could be higher, could even be lower. So I love that. There is a lot of truth in that, I think.
Eric, I'm interested in your critique. I'm watching you thinking.
I don't know. I went meta on this. I'm like, oh, do I actually agree with the benefit in the reinforcing loop? And is that framed right? I mean, within the bounds, the scope of the system as you've sketched it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
If you're not laying out the groundwork to be ready, then it's probably going to create frustration when you're asked to adjust things. It fits the template. I'm not sure where the willingness to respond to change feels like it might be coming in at the wrong spot, but maybe not.
So
Anyway, but it's an interesting one, and it's a useful one to talk through for me, like for the leader.
so this is where the limiting one became, and that was like I'm just going to hunt to try and represent it using his thinking to go, what is the limiting factor? Because so often what he is tracing to here is to go, the limiting factor is it's the point of leverage, right? And what I generally know is to jump out of this thing, right? Because what I see really commonly is, for example, your product management and architects. My argument is, as a product manager or architect, you should be spending 80% of your time in the future, 20% of your time available to support the current PR. Right? Really easy way to think about where you live in time horizons. But if you've scrambled into this PI, there's a whole bunch of questions coming up every day that are dragging you back into the present and preventing you with moving into the future. Because, teams are hitting the product manager and the architect day to day to go, what's going on with this? We need an answer on that. We need a clarification on this. We need a decision on this. And then being trapped in that day to day is stopping them from doing the forward look ahead, right? Another example, teams being able to spend time spiking features before PR planning, right? Does the team see the feature for the first time at PR planning? Have they had exposure and a chance to do a bit of exploration and discovery work before PR planning? So they've got the ability to ask better questions and provide better thinking when they're in PR planning. And the intervention to escape the trap that I've always found we need is to get business owners to go, don't scramble like crazy to meet the commitments for this PI and set yourself up for the same thing as next. Right? Let's deliberately preserve the time that we had put aside for preparation and accept deferring objectives into the next PI over trying insanely to hold to the objectives that we overcommitted to and, rinsing and repeating the same problem. And so it was that, and I was looking for short words instead of long words, but that notion of the willingness to respond to change, to me, is the willingness of the business owners to go, stop, take the time to get out of the trap, as opposed to continuing down the cycle, which is always where I wind up as a coach. And at that moment that I got to the limiting factor being, yes, that's my coaching intervention, is the discussion with the business owners. I went, okay, well, that's the limiting factor working for me in the systems model. So, yeah, I think if I had drawn this without going archetype land, it would have been the biggest, squiggliest set of lines in terms of all the potential flow and impacts possible. Driving down to that, couple of things per loop, limiting factor, took it back to, okay, maybe I just recognize it because that's what I wind up doing. But boy, I've seen it as a pattern again and again and again.
So maybe, at risk of transitioning us before we should do this, I'm wondering if that focusing on the planning quality is actually a shifting of the burden.
Well, that's a good shift. Let's talk about shifting of the burden. because I stayed in the same metaphor of my experiments there. It's you've probably seen. Let's jump in System of the Birding Land. And the intro comment. The underlying problem is difficult for people to address, either because it's obscure or costly to confront. So people shift the burden of their problem to other solutions, well-intentioned, easy fixes, which seem extremely efficient. Unfortunately, the easier solutions only ameliorate the symptoms. They leave the underlying problem unaltered. Let's go to some purple responses to that one.
This one's frankly a short one. You know how much I care about purpose and people knowing where and why we're going, and the sadness I have of rote work and people that are just doing what they're told, and lacking the intrinsic motivation that comes with it. And this whole like thread through here gets into the nature of local optimization and what happens if you don't know the big picture of what we're trying to grow and improve and pursue right now. And that's kind of it. I mean, I can go unpack that if people have questions, but it's like, if you don't know where you're going, you're only going to fix where you're at.
Yeah.
Or if I apply the Boy Scout principle here, like you might have the perfectly clean campground, but there's a hillside and a ravine full of trash just around the corner.
So I'm going to jump to the post that I drew connected to this because I was just feeling controversial when I did it. Is red string an example of shifting the burden? And by red string, for anybody who doesn't live in the world of SAFe, I'm talking about getting better at dependency management and visualizing dependencies.
This is actually a good question.
Yes, I'm going to say yes.
To be honest, I've never thought about that in this way, but I'd probably go in Eric's direction.
I think the important thing is to ask yourself which problem symptom you're asking that in the context of. So I chose to think about it in the context of we're not going fast enough. We want to deliver more with more predictability, and the outcomes of our release trains delivery aren't what we would desire them to be. And if you pick that one, then it is a wonderful tool to unblock one thing one time. And if you keep seeing the same red string in the same red places between the same two dang teams, then you've clearly hit the symptom patching and getting really good at relationships between those teams instead of rebalancing the teams or rebalancing and fixing the architecture.
That was where, like, I just, and it was this thread all the way through the shifting the burden thing for me, is his commentary about, the symptomatic fix and the way you become addicted to the symptomatic fix. Because we all talk about the fact that, red string draws your attention to the things you've got to fix to get rid of the red string. But the world is full of people going, well, we just live with the world of red string, and now we're great at drawing pretty cobwebs.
That's where I was pausing and made me think a while. It's like I don't inherently see dependencies as bad, because sometimes in this case the cost to remove a dependency permanently may not actually be optimal, either in a cost sense or in a long-term goal sense.
In the early days, like first PR planning, the number of times that I've had teams come up to me and go, that's amazing, Mark. I've never understood dependencies before. Because dependencies was always some weapon that a project manager waved around. And all of a sudden you've created this context where a team self-identifies a dependency with another team, and they understand it as a promise or a handshake, and they feel more enlightened and more empowered as a team because they're like, we know how we're connected to the other team. It's had the discussion, and we can really contextualize the relationships between us and others, and it's really powerful when that happens. So it's not that it's all a bad thing, but I thought the addiction aspect, as he drew it out, was great, and I see a diagram moving. So why don't we transition to team topologies? Surprise, surprise. Given that I know we all love team topologies, I've got no idea who just dragged it, but I'm going to guess it's Eric because that's his habit of helping me navigate a Miro while we're talking. You're muted.
It's for the best because I'm busy putting the link to team topologies over, but just this diagram, to me, this is the red string journey. Red string shows me that you need to work together as two teams to discover, and over time you either spin off a service, you create a more recurring thing, or you don't because it's okay, and it's not actually that painful. But our conversation made me think of this as there's a natural evolution of the nature of red string that could stay dangerous, or it's just a routine. Yeah, there's a little risk here, just like there always is, but it's not something that's struggling with. It's not actually a problem to fix. And give Luke Holman credit. He's been challenging my thinking on are dependencies bad in a way that's been making me think lately. And I appreciate that because it's easy to say, yeah, every dependency horrible. But that may not actually be the goal. If you have a dense service-oriented structure and you have some cascading larger changes that go through your system, and they're a different combination of teams that are cascading every time, that's actually a healthy system. It's when you have the same monolith with the same team that's always the bottleneck and has all the string going to it, and nobody's thinking about Strangler Ivy or how to create service wrappers or anything else, and that team is always dragging the train down. That's when the red string, it's like you just need this. It needs to get darker every time if it's the same string, or the thicker every time, or more woven and braided or something.
That's an interesting idea in terms of visualizing. In fact, I think I'm going to start to think deeply on that one. Although I don't know about different types of string. No, it's an interesting one. But it feels like a good jump to the next highlight quote I had here, which was often but not always in shifting the burden structures, there's also an additional reinforcing amplifying process created by side effects of the symptomatic solution. And that was really the jump, and it was an interesting prod to go, well, if I've got two loops, which are both balancing loops, and the convention that says the top loop is the symptomatic solution and the bottom loop's the fundamental solution, then the reinforcing loop on the side around the things that are created by the symptomatic solution, that reinforces your dependence on the symptomatic solution, I thought was a really nice, again, call out. And obviously lots of examples from him about addictions in the chapter as he wrote it.
Something that's coming up for me, and I'm not going to do it right now live in front, but it has me wanting to model my boomerang principle in terms of these loops. And by boomerang principle, I mean the pattern where there's a holy war usually in the community around it, where the same thing is horribly bad or really good, depending on whether you've done the intervening growth steps. So classic example for me is multiple teams working on the same feature. Ideally, early on, you're going from you need all the teams on the train to do their part to each team can own and move a feature and carry it forward. And that's a transition and pattern. But then later I can get back to where the same evidence is I have three teams swarming on the same feature and it's going faster because of it. But that's another level of maturity. But if I look in Jira or Rally or whatever, I see the exact same data pattern for both. So there's a lot of practices like that where I call them boomerang practices where you need to stop doing it. But then when you get really good at something, it's actually healthy to start doing it again for a different reason. And I feel like there might be something hiding in here where I could model them these ways.
I look forward to seeing the model.
It's been to write up the boomerang thing has been perennially on my backlog for like 7 years, so I should probably get around to it as well.
Probably. So jumping on, subtle reinforcing cycles, dependence on the symptomatic solution. What I loved on that kind of the notion of the reinforcing and the subtle side effect, I loved his example about the organization that was struggling to shift product, so they spent on advertising. And it was do more advertising, motivate the sales staff more, yada, 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 as opposed to go, why is our product not moving? Maybe the product's wrong, competitors are impacting us. We're not scanning the market in terms of our product. We're just getting better at selling it and promoting it. But when he went to that next layer and he went, it became so entrenched that the last 3 CEOs had all been ex-advertising executives. Right? It was that beautiful call out to me to go, it wasn't just that we resorted to advertising, but then the fact that we resorted to advertising had us promoting advertising people. And the self-reinforcing was the more that you went, if advertising is the way we solve problems, then we promote people who are advertising people. Therefore, we're going to naturally perpetuate the fact that advertising is the way that we solve problems. That linkage back down there, I just thought was a beautiful highlight of the reinforcing principle. Who comes to light when you're fixing a problem, which maybe takes us back to our comments about becoming dependent on coaches.
I wasn't ready for that insight.
It's a little bit uncomfortable, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. But if how many companies hire experienced agile coaches who have successes elsewhere to lead their laces?
Yeah. Let's move on. Kneffen's falling off the cliff. So the quote that obviously we both highlighted, Eric, was that shifting the burden structures tend to produce periodic crises when the symptoms of stress surface. And I saw that and I went, oh my goodness, I recognize that so much. Talk us through Kneffen and falling off the cliff.
Kneffen is big, so I'm not going to talk through it. But one of the things, as Dave Snowden talks about complexity and its role in organizations, is some things, hopefully I get this right because it's been a while since I've articulated, but some things become so obvious and locked in that realm that they just become part of the water and they're just done normally, and there's no thought to them anymore until the conditions change in some way that cause that obvious, consistent, always done practice to no longer be fit for purpose. And at that point, because it's almost receded from consciousness, it's not oh, this is something we should look at and fix. It actually just kind of goes unnoticed until the conditions change enough that the entire system plunges into chaos, and you have to climb back out through complexity and complicated models, even if the thing itself should be obvious and remains obvious. So that navigating that falling off from something as being treated as obvious, and now that treatment is no longer sufficient, throwing the system into chaos, just resonated as being very similar to this idea of crises that come up because we've shifted the burden too long. And I'm looking for a reasonable page to link into the show notes. It might be a minute.
While you're doing that, I'm going to take us to, I just had a scan. I couldn't see any highlights dropped in from Wolfgang or Dave. So I'm going to put my own self-experimentation under the microscope again. So I stayed in the theme of PR planning struggles, but it was really PI execution struggles. And I made my connecting condition struggles to meet expectations, which I think I like a little bit differently to ability to land the plan. And the fact that all too often when you're struggling, right, because often you've got top cover, your first train or two, you've got a whole bunch of top cover that's helping you bulldoze through stuff. And then the top cover runs out of life, which may be a commons type archetype. But struggles to meet expectations, what do? You go, you escalate, you hack your way through, you throw extra bodies at the problem. And that's your kind of symptomatic solution. And then you've got your root cause resolution, right? Why are we struggling? We've got architectural problems, we've got tech debt, we've got over bloated approval processes, whatever the case might be, as the root cause side. And then I sat and I went, okay, if that's the two connections, what's the insidious side effect? And I wound up with expectation that Agile's about hacks and escalations. And I don't know that I phrased it right in the end, but it was that notion of that we wind up brute forcing our way through the system really easily and start to rely on brute force and executive support to get cut through for change. And maybe that's a much better way, right? As I talk about it. It's
I see where you're at, because there's a balancing loop, and actually it does meet this pattern where you work on value stream after value stream and you never remove the friction from the underlying processes. So more and more arts are relying on exceptions processes from the governance framework in order to move forward and do their work. And if you never remove the friction, if you never adapt the governance processes to explicitly make Agile easy, then at some point you're going to have that explosion that occurs when the governance organizations throw up their hands and say, screw it all, I'm not letting you do this anymore in one shape or another. And you come to the crisis point. In my journey of the lace, I show that as the explosion, because you've pushed too hard too fast and you never actually clean up the system that allows it to go harder and faster.
yeah. And it just becomes exhausting driving the exceptions. And boy, I've seen that a lot again. I think I like that reliance on exceptions framing. So without getting stuck too hard on the loop, I think what I wanted to share was the thinking for me of driving myself into the archetype model. It was, again, getting to that discipline of going, what's the connector of the loop? And what's the one or two key call outs either in the two balancing loops, and what's the side effect? Just prompting yourself to really be deliberate about how you thought about the system. And, these were 10-minute attempts done at 1 a.m. because I promised myself that I'd have a crack before we were talking today. But, I really found the prompting of the archetype use and the core model he presents for the archetype was a good trigger for making me think. And then again, testing them with you, again, it's instead of producing a very frightening, huge diagram with a million circles and connections, getting down to something really simplistic and really testing your thinking on that simplistic thing as a highlighting tool was probably my big takeaway from playing with Yak.
Well done for giving it a go.
Been a few years. So we're over time, but we made it through the 2 chapters. Half an hour ago, I went, yeah, let's stick to getting through the 2 chapters, particularly with Dave being an hour late.
I'm so sorry. I will have to do better in future. I adjusted my clock.
I thought what I'd do is just jump us up to the next week. Thank you, Eric. So next week, chapters 7 and 8, the rubber band connecting vision and current reality, belief in powerlessness or unworthiness, your current reality and your vision, mental models and visions. I have very carefully not read ahead so that it's going to be fresh in my mind. So now I'm excited to pick this book up again.
That's kind of what I did. I flipped ahead to get the names of what's going to be in the chapters, and just to put a place out there, the rubber band metaphor is the one thing that stayed with me from this book over years. Of everything in it, that's the one thing I pointed back to when people talked about the book.
There you go. Closing retro. Last week we made some tweaks. Felt like a really good week. This week, Eric made a comment in the back channel early that we were just kind of ping-ponging from idea to idea instead of interacting about the ideas and the insights. I slowed down to take the interactions and get out of the ping-pong a little bit. And then, wow, we slowed down. But then I also really enjoyed slowing down because it's actually the deep interaction and the provocation. That's the value for me of the book club as opposed to just self-reflection. So I'm a bit torn. I'm interested in your thoughts.
So for me, there was a big takeaway on chapter 6 because I really like the modeling that you did with the loops, but and I was more listening than talking in chapter 6. So in chapter 5, I was giving all the comments that I had in mind while I was reading that. Now in chapter 6, I was listening because for me it was it puzzled me, to be honest, because now we are all in this change management world for decades. And so even we are struggling in trying to find consistent words for like fleshing out these loops. And this is something that I hadn't had on the radar when I read that. It was like, this is true. We really have to develop a certain language or a certain understanding of how these loops work and what is really influencing each other and things. And this is not so easy to do, even when we have decades of experience in this area. And so this was a big aha effect for me, much more than anything that we talked about in chapter 5. It's like, okay, this is the language that we talked in chapter 5 about, that we have to learn and to build up together so that we are able, like medical doctors, building up a language together to be able to to describe a certain illness or whatever, or a certain problem that a patient might have. So thank you for that, because this probably will stay with me for a while. This revelation, I would call it.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm a very visual thinker. I used to ex-graphic designer, so I love that my whole life is about visualizing things. And I'm very glad you actually gave it a go, Mark, because I've watched you do your thing, and then I've watched you tweak it and change it, and with all your experience, watching you remodel your own thinking. And I'm just thinking to myself, as a visual thinker, I really should be doing more stuff like this. I should be simplifying diagrams to get the things right in my head, and to burn away all my cognitive biases just to get right to the core of it. And I think you've kind of like convinced me to try some of this myself, which I think is a very good lesson for me to learn. So I thank you for having a go at doing it.
there we go.
I think I'm just left with a desire to, in another place, streaming or not, just get together as a pair in various combinations and test this out a few more times. Like Wolfgang made the point that we were struggling to do this. I'll be honest, I was resisting to do it because I could see myself going deep into even just doing one loop and having a phenomenal conversation, but that's not really the point of the book club.
Yeah.
But I find myself really wanting to practice the discipline of thinking about things in a new way like this. And whether it's this one or some of the other ideas or models, and we've talked about Zone to Win, I'm anxious to get back out and start doing some of that.
Yeah, I must confess, when I sat and played last night, I went, okay, at least Eric's going to tear this to shreds, but I'm going to do it anyway. But I also, like you, I went, I'd love to do, and it's not a book club setting. But figuring out Miro is a great place to draw a systems diagram. It's so easy using the Miro tools and the way the Miro arrow works. Playing with systems diagrams in other moments together as one of the tools of the way we explore concepts. I think that was my excitement. But kind of coming back to how we balance the book club time, where we sit, where we move, how we interact. What would you change next week?
We have 3 listeners. Are any of the listeners having ideas, or is that the 3 of us?
None of them have spoken in chat, but
I liked it a lot this time. Like the first part in chapter 5, when we had a lot of like different different parts of the book that we highlighted and we talked about that. But the second part, where I think it really adds to the understanding of the book, like drawing things like that. Of course, it's not really just going into certain paragraphs or sentences and trying to come up with an explanation for myself what that means. But for me, this is probably this was the strongest part. The diagrams that you drew and the discussions that we had about them in the context of the chapter. So this is probably something that I would like to do more. Like not just going through the different sentences that we highlighted, but really go one step further. This is just like the impression that I have at that moment.
Thank you. Dave?
I have to get on this board earlier because you guys keep picking all the best quotes. So I have to adjust my pattern of interacting with this board because I looked at it this time and like you guys had all the best stuff, so I had not much else to add. But no, it's good. I'm enjoying it. I mean, now that it's more visual, I think this is going to become quite exciting. I think.
So, just a little bit of feedback from me that would help is the night before I sit down and I go, what if you all dropped on? And where are the moments of density for us that we're going to navigate? And if you can do things like, and always feel free to move my stuff around, right? But if you can find, if we three of us have highlighted the same note, that's awesome. That's a place to have a conversation. But when you drop things on, you can put the connecting lines in and you can make it spatially connected. And if you see somebody's beating you to it, you can go, let me add a post-it note on the side to remind me what excited me about it. That really helps me help us, because I can just look down and go, hey, we all got excited about X, and I don't have to scan the Miro to figure out whether anybody dropped something randomly somewhere else on the Miro that related to that. Because what I'm loving most about the whole processing together is the connections. And this triggers that connection, this triggers that thought. And then I watch a connection that's made for you and I go, well, that makes an extra connection for me that I hadn't made the time before. And so spending time on the places that we've all drawn connections from is a really natural kind of conversation flow piece for me. So on that note, let's say sayonara and new chapters next week.